The night Adelaide Rhodes arrived in Caldwell, Kansas, the sky was the color of a bruise, and she had exactly $11, a worn leather satchel, and the unshakable feeling that she had made a terrible mistake. It was the spring of 1879, and Caldwell was not a gentle town. It sat at the edge of the Kishom Trail like a man who had been in too many fights and had stopped bothering to hide his scars. There were saloons that never closed, a cattle yard that smelled of dust and manure and money, and a general population of cowboys, traders, gamblers, and outlaws who regarded a woman traveling alone with either suspicion or hunger, and neither felt particularly welcoming. Adelaide had come from St. Louis, which was not a gentle city either, but it was a familiar kind of hard. She was 24 years old, with dark brown hair that she kept pinned back with whatever she could find, and eyes that people sometimes described as stormy gray and sometimes described as green depending on the light and depending on how closely they were paying attention. She had grown up helping her father with horses. Her father, Samuel Rhodes, had been a veterinarian of modest reputation and tremendous stubbornness, and he had taught Adelaide everything he knew about animals before a fever took him in the winter of 1877. After that, she had stayed in St. Louis long enough to settle his debts, sell the small house they had shared, and realize that the city held nothing else for her. She had heard about Caldwell through a man named Abe Finley, who ran a telegraph office in St. Louis and had a cousin in Kansas who said the town needed a school teacher. Adelaide was not precisely a school teacher, but she was educated and she was desperate, so she had packed her satchel and bought a train ticket to the end of the line, and then a stage ticket for the rest of the way, and now here she was, standing in front of a boarding house called the Mercer House with mud on her boots and a sky that was turning a deeply unsettling shade of green at the edges. The woman who ran the Mercer House was named Pearl Owens, and she was 60 years old and did not waste words. She took one look at Adelaide, took one look at the sky, and said, "You'd better come inside before that decides to be a tornado." Adelaide came inside. The room Pearl showed her to was small and clean, with a window that rattled in the wind, a narrow bed with a patchwork quilt, and a washstand with a pitcher of water. It was the finest room Adelaide had seen in 3 weeks, and she sat on the edge of the bed and let herself breathe for the first time since St. Louis. Pearl set a tray of supper on the small table by the window, salt pork, beans, cornbread, and said, "You hear about the schoolteacher position?" "I am," Adelaide said. "Is it still available?" "It was as of Tuesday," Pearl said. "You want to speak to Reverend Gaines about that. He runs the town school when there's enough children and enough daylight to justify it." She paused. "You got any experience with children?" "I have experience with most living things," Adelaide said honestly. Pearl looked at her for a long moment with eyes that were sharp and kind at once. "You ride?" "Yes." "Good," Pearl said. "You'll need to." And then she left Adelaide to her supper and the sound of the wind picking up outside. The storm did not become a tornado that night, but it became something else, something wet and loud and persistent, and Adelaide lay in her narrow bed listening to the rain hammer the roof and thought about what she had gotten herself into. She thought about her father. She thought about the way he used to talk to horses, low and patient, the way some men talk to God. She thought about the first time she had helped him deliver a foal, how frightened she had been, and how alive she had felt afterward, standing in the lantern light with her arms trembling and a new creature breathing in the straw beneath her hands. She fell asleep thinking about that, and she slept better than she had in months. She met Jasper Brenner 3 days later, and the meeting was entirely unremarkable. She had gone to the feed store on Sycamore Street to ask about whether anyone in town might need an extra hand with horses, while she waited to speak to Reverend Gaines about the schoolteacher position. And Jasper was already there, leaning against the counter with his hat pushed back on his head, and a look on his face that suggested he had been waiting longer than he wanted to be waiting. He was tall, with a build that came from actual work rather than the idea of work, and he had dark hair that needed cutting and a jaw that needed shaving. And when he glanced over at Adelaide as she came through the door, his eyes were a particular shade of blue that she noticed and immediately told herself she had not noticed. He was 28 years old, though she did not know that yet. She did not know much about him, yet except that he was wearing the kind of clothes that meant he owned land, not the kind that meant he worked for someone else, and that he had the particular posture of a man who was used to making decisions and was quietly exhausted by that fact. The man behind the counter, a round-faced man named Dole, was explaining to Jasper that the order of oats he had been expecting would not arrive until the following week because of some trouble with the supply wagon coming up from Wichita. "That's the second delay this month," Jasper said, and his voice was low and even, the kind of voice that did not need to raise itself to make a point. "I know it, Mr. Brenner, and I'm sorry for it," Dole said. He sounded genuinely sorry. Most people seemed to feel that way around Jasper Brenner, Adelaide would later discover, not out of fear, but out of a kind of respect that had been earned quietly and over time. Jasper straightened up from the counter, settled his hat, and turned toward the door. He was nearly through it when he noticed Adelaide properly and stepped aside to let her pass. "Ma'am," he said. "Thank you," she said. "That was the whole of it." He walked out and she walked up to the counter and asked Dole about horses, and Dole said that the Brenner ranch out on the North Road was always busy this time of year with the foaling season, and that Jasper Brenner was a good man who paid fair, and that she might try there if she was looking for work involving animals. Adelaide wrote down the direction and folded it into her pocket and went to see Reverend Gaines. The school did need a teacher. It needed one rather urgently, as it turned out, because the previous teacher had married a man passing through on his way to New Mexico and had followed him with what everyone agreed was more optimism than wisdom. There were 14 children in Caldwell of school age, and they had been without instruction for 2 months, and the Reverend, a thin, earnest man with spectacles, was very glad to see Adelaide. They settled on a salary modest, but enough, and the use of a small schoolroom attached to the church, and Adelaide began teaching the following Monday. Teaching was harder than horses in some ways and easier in others. Horses did not argue with you about arithmetic, but they also did not look at you with the particular expression of a 9-year-old who has just understood something for the first time, and Adelaide found that expression was worth more than she had expected. She kept the note about the Brenner ranch in her pocket anyway, because teaching paid modest and the boarding house charged every week. It was not until the last week of April that she went. She had heard about Jasper Brenner in the way that you heard about anyone in a small town in pieces, from different people, at different times. Pearl told her that he had come to Caldwell 6 years ago from somewhere in Texas, that he had bought a piece of land north of town that everyone said was too rocky and too dry to be worth anything, and that he had turned it into a working ranch through what Pearl described as sheer bloody-minded determination. The blacksmith, whose name was Henry Tate, told her that Brenner's horses were the finest in the county, and that he had a way with mares that other breeders spent their whole lives trying to learn. One of her students, a girl named Clara Dole, who was the feed store man's daughter, told her that Mr. Brenner had a dog named Corporal who had 3 legs and was very brave, and that this seemed to Adelaide to be the most important piece of information of all. She rode out to the ranch on a gray mare she had borrowed from the Mercer House stable on a warm Tuesday afternoon when the schoolroom was closed for the day, and the air smelled of new grass and distant cattle. The Brenner ranch was not large in the way that wealthy men's ranches were large. It was not the kind of place that announced itself with a grand gate and a long straight drive. Instead, it appeared gradually, as you came over a low rise of ground, a collection of buildings that had been put up carefully and added to over time, a main house of weathered timber, a large barn, 2 smaller outbuildings, and a series of fenced paddocks where horses moved in the afternoon light like something out of a painting. Adelaide stopped her borrowed mare at the fence and counted 7 horses visible from where she sat, and each one of them was beautiful, and she felt her chest do something complicated in response. A voice came from behind her. "They're not for sale today." She turned. Jasper Brenner was coming across the yard from the direction of the barn, wiping his hands on a cloth, and there was that blue-eyed look again, steady and assessing but not unkind. "I'm not here to buy," Adelaide said. "I heard you might need an extra hand during foaling season. I have experience with horses. Significant experience." He stopped a few feet away and looked at her the way men looked at things they were trying to determine the value of, which she recognized from years of watching her father deal with clients, and which she had learned to wait out with patience. "You're the new school teacher," he said. It was not quite a question. "I am Adelaide Rhodes, Jasper Brenner." He did not offer his hand, which was the custom, but he nodded with a directness that felt like the same thing. "What kind of experience?" "My father was a veterinarian in St. Louis. I helped him for 12 years. Foalings, calvings, difficult births, general care and treatment. I can set a leg, I can stitch a wound, I can read a horse's condition well enough to tell you 3 days before you'd otherwise notice that something is wrong." He was quiet for a moment. The 3-legged dog materialized from somewhere and sat beside his left boot, and regarded Adelaide with one brown eye and one blue eye and an expression of serious inquiry. "That's Corporal," Jasper said. "I heard about him," Adelaide said. She crouched down slowly and held out her hand, and Corporal sniffed it with great deliberation and then accepted it, which seemed to satisfy something in Jasper's face that she couldn't quite name. "I've got 3 mares due in the next 6 weeks," he said. "One of them is going to be trouble. She's old for foaling and the foal is presenting awkward." He said this flatly, as a statement of practical fact, but she heard something underneath it that sounded like worry. "Show me," she said. He showed her. The mare's name was Sunday, and she was 16 years old, which was old for a first-time mother, and Adelaide could see immediately what he meant about the awkward presentation. She spent 20 minutes with the horse, speaking quietly and moving carefully, running her hands along Sunday's sides, and Jasper stood back and watched and did not interrupt, which told her something about him. "She'll be all right," Adelaide said finally. "But she'll need watching. The foal is going to need help turning. It won't be a quick birth." "I know it," he said. "Then you know you'd rather have someone with you than not." He looked at her for another long moment. "I'll pay you the same as I pay my hands," he said. "Weekday evenings and weekends until the foalings are done." "That's fair," she said, and that was how it began. It was not romantic in those first weeks. It was work, which was perhaps the best possible foundation for anything. Adelaide would finish her school day, ride out to the Brenner ranch, and spend her evenings helping to check on the pregnant mares, attending to the general health of the other horses, and gradually learning the particular rhythms of the place. Jasper was not a man who talked much for the sake of talking, but he talked about his horses readily, and with a kind of articulate affection that she found unexpectedly moving. He could describe the temperament and history of each animal with the same detail that a scholar might use for a subject of study. And listening to him, she began to understand that this ranch was not merely his livelihood but something more like his vocation. He had 2 hands who worked for him. A young man named Chet who was 19 and enthusiastic and not entirely reliable, and an older man named Hector Reyes who had been a vaquero in Texas and whose skill with horses rivaled Jasper's own. Hector was quiet and careful and watched Adelaide's first few days with an expression that was neither welcoming nor hostile, but simply watchful. And then one afternoon she spent 2 hours talking a colicky, gelding through a crisis with nothing but patience and low-voiced calm. And after that, Hector spoke to her like a colleague, which she valued more than most compliments she had received in her life. The first 2 mares foaled without major incident in the first 2 weeks of May. Adelaide was present for both, arriving in the early evening to find Jasper already in the barn with his sleeves rolled up, and that particular concentrated stillness that she was beginning to recognize as his version of anxiety. Both foals came into the world healthy and wet and indignant, and both times Adelaide stood up afterward with her arms trembling and her heart pounding, and felt that old feeling she remembered from her father's barn, the feeling of having been present at something that mattered. The second time, when the foal was finally standing and the mare was nuzzling it with the intensity of a creature that has just discovered the most important thing in the world, Jasper said quietly, "Thank you." Just those two words, but the way he said them made her feel that he was not the kind of man who said them lightly. "That's what I'm here for," she said, and then felt, for reasons she could not entirely explain, that she had said the wrong thing, or at least a smaller thing than what had actually been exchanged between them. They started talking more after that, in the way that people talk when they have been through something together, and found that they were not entirely incompatible. She told him about her father and about St. Louis, about the small house and the long nights and the parade of animals that had passed through their care. He told her about Texas, slowly and in pieces, the way you pry something apart that has been stuck for a long time. He had grown up on a ranch there that had belonged to his uncle, a hard man named Frank Brenner who had not been kind but who had been competent, and from whom Jasper had learned everything practical there was to know about horses and cattle and the management of land. When his uncle died, the ranch had passed to a cousin, and Jasper had come north with enough money saved to buy his piece of rocky ground in Kansas and start over. "You weren't sorry to leave?" Adelaide asked one evening. They were sitting on the fence of the largest paddock watching the last light go out of the sky, which was something she had started doing after the evening checks were done and before she rode back to town, and which Jasper had not discouraged. "No," he said. "I was sorry to leave what I thought it was going to be. The actual place, not particularly." She understood that. She had been sorry to leave St. Louis in the same way, sorry about the idea of a life she had pictured there and not about the life she had actually been living. "What did you think it was going to be?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. "A home," he said, "not just a property." She looked at him sidelong in the fading light, and he was looking at the horses, not at her, and his face had the expression of a man who has said something more personal than he intended and is deciding how he feels about that. She decided not to press it. She stored it away instead, the way she stored everything about him, carefully and without quite acknowledging to herself why she was doing it. The trouble was that she was noticing him. She had been noticing him since that first afternoon by the fence, but she had told herself it was simply the professional awareness she brought to any new situation, taking stock, assessing, and that explanation had served well enough for the first week or two. But there was a limit to how long you could claim that the way a man moved through a space was something you were observing professionally, or that the way he looked at his horses with a tenderness he didn't seem to know was visible told you something merely diagnostic about his character. He was not an easy man in many ways. He was private and he was stubborn, and he had a way of going quiet when something troubled him that she suspected drove other people to distraction. She found it frustrating herself, until she began to understand that his silences were not absence but a particular kind of presence, that he was in fact paying very close attention during those quiet intervals, and that things registered with him that a louder person might have missed. She was not sure when she had started hoping that he was noticing her back. She only knew that one evening when she said she should be heading back to town and he said, "You don't have to go yet." Something in her chest expanded like a window being opened in a stuffy room. "I've got school tomorrow," she said. "You've got school tomorrow," he agreed. But she noticed that he said it as a fact he was accepting rather than one he particularly wanted to. She went anyway, and rode back to town in the dark with the stars very close and Corporal's distant bark following her down the road, and she thought about what it meant that she was thinking about this at all, and she thought about her father's advice about horses, which was that you could want them badly and rush them badly, and it would make everything worse, and that the only way to get anywhere with a creature that had its own will was patience and steadiness and showing up every day. She suspected this was also true of certain men, The storm came in the third week of May. It had been building all day in the way that bad Kansas storms built, gradually and then all at once, the sky going from blue to white to a terrible greenish-gray over the course of the afternoon, while the air got heavy and close, and the horses grew restless in their paddocks. Adelaide had been watching it from the schoolroom windows with a particular attention, because she had learned in the weeks she had been in Caldwell that the weather here was not decorative but consequential, and that the difference between a storm that blew through and a storm that stayed and became something serious was a distinction worth being able to read. By the time she dismissed the children that afternoon, the clouds were stacked on the western horizon like something enormous and patient that had been waiting all spring to arrive. She rode out to the ranch without going back to the boarding house first, and arrived to find the paddock gates already secured and Hector and Chet moving the younger horses into the far barn. Jasper met her in the yard with his hat pulled low against the first advance winds and something tight around his eyes. "Sunday," he said. Adelaide felt her stomach drop. She started. An hour ago, earlier than she should have, he was already moving toward the main barn and she was already moving with him. The timing couldn't be worse. "Timing never is," she said. Sunday was in the largest stall at the back of the barn, and one look at her told Adelaide everything she needed to know and several things she would have preferred not to. The mare was down on her side, which was normal, but her breathing was too rapid and her sides were sheening with sweat that wasn't just exertion. And when Adelaide knelt beside her and did her assessment, she felt immediately the thing she had felt weeks ago, the foal presenting wrong, still positioned wrong, and now the labor had started and the clock was running. "She needs help now," Adelaide said. She was already pulling off her jacket. "Get me warm water and clean cloths. As much lamp oil as you have lit in here, I need to be able to see." Jasper moved without hesitation, which she was grateful for. There were men who would have argued or second-guessed in that moment, and Jasper was not one of them. He had Chet running for water and Hector adjusting the lamps before Adelaide had finished rolling up her sleeves. Outside, the storm announced itself. The first real crack of thunder came like a door being slammed by something enormous, and the barn walls shuddered with it, and Sunday's eyes went white and wide with fear. Adelaide put her hand on the mare's neck immediately and spoke to her, low and even, the same words her father used to use, which were not magic words but simply the sound of calm in an uncalm world. "Easy now. You're all right. I've got you. You're doing fine. I've got you." The rain came next, not gradually but all at once, as if whatever had been holding it back simply let go, and it hit the barn roof with a sound like applause at a very large and enthusiastic theater. And then it got louder, and then louder still, until it was a continuous roar that swallowed all other sound and left Adelaide speaking into a world of noise and lamplight, and the sweet sharp smell of clean straw going wet with steam. Lightning split the sky outside and the barn went white for a fractured second, and Sunday screamed, not a sound Adelaide had words for in any language she knew, a sound that was pure animal distress, and Jasper was there, on his knees on the other side of the mare, his hands in her mane, his voice doing what Adelaide's voice was doing. "Easy, Sunday. Easy, girl. We've got you." They worked. It was the kind of work that leaves no room for anything else. No room for fear or fatigue or the noise outside, or the thoughts that had been accumulating over weeks of evenings, by a fence in the fading light. There was only the mare and the foal and the problem of getting the one safely out of the other, and Adelaide moved through it with the focus her father had taught her, methodical and steady, making the adjustments that needed to be made, talking constantly, her hands certain even when the situation was not. Hector was there and Chet was there, and at one point Chet knocked over the bucket of water and swore, and Hector said something in Spanish that was probably also swearing, and Adelaide said, "More water, please, now," without looking up, and somehow there was more water and the work continued. Jasper never left his position by Sunday's head. He stroked the mare's neck and he talked to her, and he kept looking up at Adelaide with an expression that she would not process until much later. It was too complex for the moment, too many things at once, and Adelaide kept her attention on the task, and her voice even and her hands sure, and the storm raged, and the lamps flickered and swayed. The foal turned. It was not dramatic when it happened, not a sudden shift but a gradual one, Adelaide guiding with practiced hands, Sunday's labor working with her now instead of against. And then the foal's head appeared, and it was perfect, dark and wet and still. And Jasper made a sound that was not quite a word, and Adelaide said, "Keep talking to her, keep her calm, we're almost there." And he did, and she did. And the foal came into the world in one long determined movement, while outside the storm screamed and shook the walls of the barn, and the lamps threw long moving shadows across everything. The foal lay in the straw, and Adelaide cleared its airway, and it breathed, and Jasper said, "Is it all right?" With a rawness in his voice that she had never heard from him before, a complete absence of the careful control he wore like another piece of clothing. "It's all right," she said. "It's perfect." The foal was a colt, dark bay with a white star on his forehead, and he was perfect, and he was breathing, and Sunday gathered herself and turned to him with that same overwhelming animal intensity that Adelaide had witnessed twice before, and which moved her every time as if it were the first time. Adelaide sat back on her heels in the straw, and the tiredness came over her all at once, the way it always did when the emergency was finished, and her body remembered that she had been running on something other than ordinary energy. Her arms were shaking, and she could feel her heart in her ears, and she was aware distantly that she was considerably wet and considerably disheveled, and that none of that mattered in the least. She looked up to tell Jasper to check the colt's legs, and he was already looking at her. He was on his knees in the straw on the other side of Sunday, his shirt dark with rain that had come through the door when Chet ran for water, his hair flattened against his forehead, and he was looking at her with an expression that she had never seen on his face before, had never seen on anyone's face in quite that way, and she did not know how to describe it except to say that it was the expression of someone who has just recognized something they have been looking for without knowing they were looking. Something in the air between them changed. She felt it the way you felt a change in atmospheric pressure before a storm, not with any single sense but with everything at once, a shift, a turning. She looked at him and he looked at her, and the storm made its terrible music above them, and Sunday nuzzled her new colt in the straw, and for a long moment neither of them said anything at all. Then Hector said, from somewhere behind them, "The colt is good, yes. He looks good," and the moment shifted and became something else, something that did not disappear but moved, like water that has been disturbed and is now flowing in a different direction. "He looks good," Adelaide said, and her voice was steady, which she was proud of. "Jasper, check his legs. Hector, can you get a fresh blanket for Sunday?" They worked for another hour, making sure the mare and foal were settled and clean and warm, making sure Sunday had water and that the colt was nursing, making sure that everything that needed to be done was done. Chet fell asleep sitting against the stall wall with his hat over his face at some point around midnight, and Hector checked everything twice, and then said good night and went to the bunkhouse. And eventually it was only Adelaide and Jasper in the barn with the colt and his mother and the sound of the rain, which had gentled now to a steady ordinary rain, no longer the extraordinary one. Adelaide was sitting on the edge of a water trough, her jacket back on but not helping much, and Jasper came and sat beside her, which left very little space between them which neither of them remarked upon. "Thank you," he said. "You said that last time," she said. "I meant it last time too," he said. She looked at him. He looked back. In the warm lamp light with the rain outside and the sound of the colt moving in the straw, his face was different than it was in daylight, or perhaps she was seeing it differently. She could see the tiredness in it and the relief in that other thing that had been there when she looked up and found him already looking at her, the thing she did not have a name for yet but was beginning to. "What are you going to call him?" she asked. Jasper considered the colt for a moment. The colt was standing now on improbable legs, his white star bright in the lamplight. "I don't know yet," he said. "What would you call him?" She thought about it seriously, the way she thought about everything. "Storm," she said. "He was born in one, he ought to know it." Jasper was quiet for a moment. "Storm," he said, as if testing the weight of it. "Yes, that's right." They sat in a comfortable quiet for a while, the kind that had become familiar over weeks of evenings, except that it was different now, charged with something that the evenings by the fence had been building toward without either of them naming it. Adelaide was aware of him beside her with a thoroughness that was beyond the ordinary. She was aware of the warmth of him and the particular smell of his clothes, horse and leather and rain, and of the fact that at some point in the last several hours she had stopped pretending to herself that what she felt when she looked at him was anything as simple as professional regard. "Adelaide," he said. She turned to look at him and found him closer than she had realized, his blue eyes level and serious and that expression still present. The one she now understood was the look of a man who had felt something break open in him and was deciding what to do about it. "Yes," she said, not an answer to any question he had asked, more like a door she was leaving open. He looked at her for a long moment. "I'm going to say something," he said, "and I want you to tell me honestly if I'm wrong about it." "All right," she said. "I think you feel the same thing I feel," he said. "I've been thinking it for a while. I could be wrong. I've been wrong before, and I'd rather know it now than later." Adelaide looked at him, this careful and private man who had built something real out of rocky ground and who talked to his horses like they mattered and who had knelt in the straw and held his mare's head through a crisis without flinching. And she said, "You're not wrong." Something moved through his face. It was not surprise exactly, but a kind of deep settling, like a thing that has been slightly off balance finding its level. He reached out slowly and tucked a strand of wet hair back from her face with a gentleness that was startling coming from those hands that she had watched work, and she had the strange sensation of being something he was being very careful with, and she found that she did not mind it even slightly. "It's late," she said. "The storm stopped." "It has," he agreed. Neither of them moved. "I should ride back to town," she said. "The road'll be muddy," he said. "You should wait until morning." She recognized this for the suggestion it was, and it was not that kind of suggestion. There was nothing of that quality in his voice, only the genuine and straightforward concern of a man who did not want her to ride 5 miles in the dark on a muddy road in the middle of the night. And she recognized also that she trusted him completely, which was a thing she had not trusted about anyone in a long time. "I'll sleep in the barn," she said, "if that's acceptable." "There's a spare room in the house," he said. "Hector's sister stays in it when she visits. It's clean and the bed's decent and it's less likely to be occupied by a horse." "That does sound better," she said. She stayed the night in the spare room, which was clean, and had a decent bed and a window that showed the new-washed sky going silver toward dawn. And she lay there, and thought about the look on his face when she had said he was not wrong. And she thought about the gentleness of those rough hands touching her face. And she thought that she had come to Caldwell with $11 and a satchel, and the unshakable feeling that she had made a terrible mistake. And now she thought perhaps she had not made a mistake at all. In the morning, Jasper made coffee and eggs on the cast iron stove, and they sat at the kitchen table in the clean light that came after a hard rain, and Corporal lay at Adelaide's feet as if he had decided something about her. And they talked about Storm and about Sunday, and about the children Adelaide was teaching, and about the plans Jasper had for expanding the South Paddock, and all of it felt entirely natural and also entirely significant. The way a conversation can be both ordinary and momentous at once. When she rose to leave, he walked her out to where her borrowed mare was waiting in the paddock, and he saddled the horse for her without being asked and without making it anything other than a practical act. And when she was in the saddle, he looked up at her with the morning light full in his face and said, "Will you come out Saturday evening? I'd like to show you the South property. I'd like to tell you what I'm thinking of doing with it." "I'll come out Saturday," she said. "Adelaide," he said. "Yes." He seemed to think about what he wanted to say, and then he said, "I'm glad you came to Caldwell. She felt that in her chest like a struck note. "So am I," she said. "So am I, Jasper." She rode back to town through the mud-bright morning, and the world felt very large and very possible. The weeks that followed were the most quietly eventful of Adelaide's life, which was something she recognized even while she was living them. She came out to the ranch on Saturday evening as she had promised, and Jasper showed her the south property, walking beside her through the long grass, and he explained what he wanted to do: expand the breeding operation, build a better facility for difficult foalings, eventually employ a full-time animal doctor if he could find one willing to come this far out. And she listened with genuine interest and offered thoughts and observations that came from her years of experience, and he listened to those with the same earnest attention. And by the time they had walked back to the ranch house in the late evening light, she felt that she had been let into some private room of his interior life. And she was glad to be there. They sat on the porch after supper. He had made supper, which she had not expected, a competent and unfussy meal that suggested a man long accustomed to feeding himself. And the night came in gently from the west, and the horses moved in the paddocks, and Corporal slept across both their feet without apparent concern for whose foot was whose. He reached over and took her hand without any preamble, and she let him, and they sat like that for a while in the pleasant and articulate dark. "Tell me what you want," he said. "Not what you settled for when you came here, what you actually want." No one had asked her that in a long time. Her father had always known without asking. There had been a man in St. Louis briefly, a solicitor's clerk named Edward Marsh, who had been kind and respectable, and for whom she had felt a moderate affection that both of them had eventually admitted was not enough. Since then there had been no one. "I want to do work that matters," she said. "I want to be somewhere that feels like a place and not just a stop. She paused. "I want to belong to things, good things. A community and a work," and she stopped again. "And," he said, "and someone," she said quietly. "I'd like that. I didn't used to admit to wanting it, but I do." His hand tightened on hers. Not a dramatic gesture, just a pressure. She felt it very thoroughly. "I've been alone a long time," he said. "By preference mostly. It was easier." He paused. "I don't know that easy is what I want anymore." She turned to look at him in the dark, the outline of his face against the stars. "Is this you saying something?" she asked. "Or still building up to it?" He turned to look at her, and she could see enough in the darkness to read him, which was remarkable because she had met men she could not read in full daylight. "I'm saying something," he said, and there was a warmth in his voice that she had heard underneath the reserve all along but which was surfacing now completely. "I'm saying that I would very much like, if you're of a mind to see where this goes. You and I seriously." "I'm of a mind," she said. He kissed her then, not the impulsive kind of kiss, but the kind that is thought out and chosen, careful and certain and warm, and she leaned into it and put her free hand against his jaw, the rough jaw that always needed shaving, and thought that this was what her father had meant, she thought, when he said some things were worth waiting for. She had not known what he meant at the time. She knew now. The summer came in earnest, and Caldwell was not a quiet town in the summer. The cattle drives came up from Texas on the Kisham Trail, and the town filled up with trail hands and merchants, and the noise and dust of commerce. And there were incidents that Pearl Owens described to Adelaide over breakfast with a kind of worn resignation. A shooting outside the Dexter saloon that left a man wounded and another one jailed. A dispute over a cattle count that required the involvement of the county sheriff. The periodic arrival of men who were traveling faster than their legal situations recommended. These were the facts of life in a cattle town in 1879, and Adelaide had grown accustomed to them, with the same pragmatic acceptance she had applied to everything else. What she found harder to accept, as summer progressed, was the particular attitude of certain men in the town toward her arrangement with Jasper. Small-town propriety was an irregular and sometimes bewildering thing, and the fact that she spent her evenings at the Brenner Ranch was not lost on the community, and the community's opinions on this subject were not uniformly approving. Mrs. Gaynor, the wife of the town doctor, made remarks at church that had the quality of accidentally overheard observations despite being directed with precision. A man named Prescott Halley, who owned one of the saloons and seemed to regard himself as a community authority, told Jasper at the feed store that Adelaide was a good schoolteacher, and it would be a shame if her reputation suffered. Jasper told Prescott Halley, with complete courtesy and absolutely no accommodation, that Adelaide's reputation was no one's concern but her own. Adelaide heard about this second-hand from Dole at the feed store, who told her with the particular relish of someone sharing news they know is important, and she was sitting with that information when Jasper came to walk her home from the school one afternoon. He had begun doing this when he was in town, which was a thing she found disproportionately pleasing, and she told him she had heard what he had said. He looked mildly uncomfortable, which she thought was because he was not a man who liked being discussed. "It needed saying," he said. "It did," she agreed. "But for the record, I'd rather you didn't have to say it on my behalf. I'm perfectly capable of I know you are," he said. "I said it because I wanted to say it, not because I thought you needed me to." He looked at her sideways as they walked. "There's a difference." She thought about that. "Yes," she said, "there is." "I'm going to say something else," he said. "Another something," she said. His mouth curved. It was not a common expression, and she treasured it accordingly. A different something, a more official something. She stopped walking. He stopped too, and turned to face her on the dusty street with the afternoon sun full on them, and a wagon going past, and everything very ordinary and also very much not. "Adelaide Rhodes," he said, and he was very serious now and very direct, and looking at her with those blue eyes that she thought she could look at for a very long time without getting tired. "I would like very much for you to consider marrying me. I don't have a great deal of ceremony in me, and I know this is not the most romantic street in the world, and I know you came here to build something of your own, and I would never want to take that from you. What I want is to build something alongside you. If you're willing." She looked at him for a moment. The wagon rattled away. Somewhere down the street someone was hammering at something and a dog was barking, and the ordinary life of Caldwell went on entirely without regard for what was happening on this particular patch of it. "Jasper Brenner," she said. "I came to Caldwell with $11 and a satchel, and I thought I had made the worst decision of my life, and instead I think I made the best one. Yes, I will marry you," he exhaled. She had not realized he had been holding his breath. He took both her hands in his and looked at her, and there was that expression again, the one from the barn in the storm, the broken open one, the one that was more honest than any words she had ever been given. "Good," he said. "That's good." They were married in October, when the heat had gentled and the Kansas plains had gone their dry autumn gold, and the ceremony was conducted by Reverend Gaines in the church where Adelaide taught school, and it was attended by Pearl Owens and Hector Rays, and Chet the ranch hand, and Dole from the feed store, and Henry Tate the blacksmith, and a surprising number of the families whose children Adelaide had been teaching all summer, who seemed to have collectively decided that their schoolteacher was their business in the warm, and invested rather than the intrusive sense. Clara Dole, who was 9 years old and had very firm opinions about everything, brought flowers that she had picked from the field behind her house and presented them to Adelaide before the ceremony with a gravity that was deeply touching. Hector Rays shook Jasper's hand with both of his and said something in Spanish that Jasper translated for Adelaide later as approximately, "You have found a good woman and you had better know it." Jasper said he did know it. He appeared to mean it completely. They did not have a honeymoon in the fashionable sense, because Jasper had a ranch to run and Adelaide had a school to teach, and neither of them was given to the fashionable sense of things anyway. What they had was the first evening in the ranch house as a home that belonged to both of them, sitting by the fire with Corporal between them, and a bottle of good whiskey that Pearl Owens had given them as a gift, and the comfortable and significant knowledge that this was real and it was theirs. Adelaide had moved her things into the ranch house the week before, and the act of arranging them alongside Jasper's things had told her more about compatibility than any amount of conversation could have, because they were very different, her books alongside his tools, her watercolor set on the mantelpiece beside his carved wooden horses. And yet the arrangement felt right, the way a chord feels right when you find the notes that work together. She still taught school. This had been discussed and settled without drama, because Jasper understood entirely that it was not Adelaide's profession but her vocation, and he would no more have asked her to give it up than she would have asked him to give up his horses. She rode to town 3 days a week, and on the other days she worked with the horses at the ranch, and this arrangement satisfied her in a way that nothing else in her life had quite managed to, the feeling of doing multiple necessary things at once. The winter was hard, as Kansas winters were. It came early, and it was cold with a dry intensity that was different from the wet cold she had known in St. Louis, and she learned new things about keeping warm and about the particular difficulty of horse care when water troughs froze overnight, and when the horses themselves needed extra attention and management. Jasper was patient with her questions, and she was patient with his silences when the cold and the work made him drawn inward, and they found a winter rhythm that worked. Storm the colt thrived. He was growing into something remarkable dark bay still, with that white star, and a temperament that combined his mother's steadiness with something of his own, a kind of spirited curiosity that made him a pleasure to work with. Adelaide had begun his early gentling in the fall, spending time with him daily, getting him accustomed to human presence and touch, and Jasper watched this with an attention that he tried to make look casual and which did not succeed at being casual. "You're good at this," he said one afternoon, watching her with Storm. "I know it," she said simply, without false modesty. "My father taught me well." "Tell me about him," Jasper said. He had asked her pieces of this before, but never the whole. She told him that afternoon, while Storm moved around the paddock behind them. She told him about Samuel Rhodes and his large hands and his particular smell of antiseptic and horses and pipe tobacco, and his habit of quoting scripture at animals that weren't improving fast enough, which she thought they found more amusing than instructive. She told him about the long nights and the difficult cases and the occasional triumphs that felt like gifts from some generous universe. She told him about the fever and the 3 weeks of it and the morning when she woke up, and the house was quiet in the particular way that a house becomes quiet when the person who made it a home is gone from it. She had told this story before in pieces to Pearl and to Hector, but she had never told it all at once to someone and watched them receive it with Jasper's quality of attention, and by the time she finished she found that she had been crying without noticing, which was not like her, and Jasper had his arm around her, which she was very glad of. "He sounds like someone worth missing," Jasper said quietly. "He was," she said. "He is." "He taught you well," Jasper said again, and this time she understood that he meant it as the highest honor he knew how to give. In the spring of 1880, Adelaide told Jasper she was expecting their first child. She told him in the morning at the kitchen table, with the window open and the smell of new grass coming in, and she watched his face go through several things in rapid succession, none of which he was quick enough to contain. First shock, then a kind of wondering computation, then something that was purely and simply joy. He stood up from the table so quickly that he knocked over his coffee cup, and he came around and lifted her out of her chair, which was not a thing he had done before, and which she found immediately that she approved of, and he held her for a long moment in the morning kitchen light, and she could feel his heart beating hard. "Are you well?" he said against her hair. "I'm perfectly well," she said. "Better than well." "You're sure?" "Jasper," she said. "I have assisted in more births than I can count. I think I know the signs." He laughed. She had made him laugh before, but this one was different, less the dry, quiet amusement she usually managed to get from him and more the full-bodied kind, the kind that came from being entirely surprised by happiness. The news traveled around Caldwell at the speed that good news traveled in small towns, which was the same speed as bad news, and people responded to it with the warmth that communities can produce when they are at their best. Pearl Owens, who was not an effusive woman, hugged Adelaide on the street and held on for longer than Adelaide expected. Hector Reyes, who was not a sentimental man, spent an entire Saturday building a cradle in the workshop that was so beautifully made that Adelaide could not look at it without her eyes going warm. The pregnancy progressed through the spring and summer in the ordinary, remarkable way of such things, and Adelaide kept teaching until July, when the dust and heat and the considerable effort of standing upright for extended periods made teaching impractical. And then she managed the ranch from a chair in the paddock, and from the kitchen table, and from the porch in the evenings, and Jasper managed her with an attentiveness that was both touching and occasionally excessive. "I am not made of glass," she told him at least twice a week. "I know that," he said at least twice a week. "I just like having you close." She could not argue with that because she felt the same. Their son was born in November in the ranch house, attended by Dr. Gaynor's wife, who turned out to be considerably kinder in practical circumstances than in gossiping ones, and by Pearl Owens, who had attended enough frontier births to serve as a capable midwife in her own right. Jasper was in the room for as much of it as Pearl permitted, which was less than he wanted but more than was typical for the time and place, and when it was done and the child was handed to Adelaide and then to Jasper, he sat in the chair by the bed with his son in his arms, and Adelaide had never seen him look so absolutely undone and so entirely right at the same time. "Samuel," Adelaide said, "if you're agreeable." He looked up at her and his eyes were bright in a way that had nothing to do with lamplight. "Samuel," he said. "Yes." Samuel Brenner came into the world weighing approximately 8.5 pounds and expressing very strong opinions about his arrival from his first breath, and he had his father's blue eyes and his mother's inclination to observe everything very carefully before deciding what to do about it. And he was the most significant thing that had ever happened in the Brenner household, which had not previously lacked for significant things. Corporal, who was by now getting old as three-legged dogs went, adjusted to the presence of the baby with philosophical grace, taking up a position near the cradle whenever Adelaide set Samuel down, and regarding him with the expression of a dog who has been given a new responsibility and intends to take it seriously. The winter that followed was hard again, as Kansas winters always were, but it was a different hard, the kind made bearable by fire and warmth and the particular contentment of a home that contained everything you needed. Adelaide, who had spent the previous winter learning the rhythms of ranch life in the cold, spent this one learning the rhythms of motherhood, which were sometimes exhausting and sometimes boring, and sometimes so piercingly beautiful that she would look up from whatever she was doing and need a moment to simply absorb what she had. Jasper was a devoted and genuine father, which she had suspected he would be. He had the same quality with Samuel that he had with his horses, patient and attentive, and physically gentle, capable of being very still and very present in a way that settled whatever he was with. He was the kind of father who got up in the night when Adelaide was tired, not dramatically or resentfully, but simply because it needed doing and he was capable of doing it. And he was the kind of father who talked to the baby as if the baby could understand him, which of course the baby could not, but which Adelaide thought was probably good practice. She watched him with Samuel one evening when the child was about 3 months old. Jasper had him against his shoulder, walking slowly around the kitchen because Samuel had been fussy and movement seemed to help, and he was talking to him in the low, even voice that he used with the horses, telling him about the ranch and about the horses, and about the plans for the South property expansion. And Samuel had stopped fussing and was listening with enormous dark blue eyes and an expression of extreme concentration that was already entirely his father's. And Adelaide felt something in her chest that she had no word for, not joy exactly, but the thing that joy became when it had been present long enough to become structural. Spring came again, and Storm was a yearling now and growing beautiful, and the South Paddock expansion was underway, and Adelaide went back to teaching in March with Samuel in a basket in the back of the schoolroom where she could see him, an arrangement that the children found fascinating and that Samuel appeared to find acceptable. There were changes happening in Caldwell and in the wider territory that Adelaide was aware of and thought about. The cattle drives were winding down, the railroad had been coming in stages, and the long trail drives up from Texas were becoming less necessary and less common, and the town was shifting accordingly, the rougher elements thinning as the economic reason for their presence diminished, the more settled elements becoming more prominent. There were families building permanent homes. There was talk of a proper school building. There was a doctor now, young Dr. Ellis, who had come from Ohio, with a medical degree and progressive ideas about hygiene that the older residents regarded with suspicion, and the younger ones found interesting. The injustices of the place were not something Adelaide could look away from, which her father had raised her not to do. The trail had brought people of many backgrounds through Caldwell, and the town's treatment of some of them was not something she was proud of. She had watched the particular hardships applied to people like Hector Reyes and his family, good and capable people who were treated with less respect and fewer courtesies than they had earned many times over, and she had said so plainly when it seemed possible to do so. Jasper shared her views on this, which was not always the case with men of his background in that time and place, and his treatment of Hector had always been that of an equal and a valued colleague, but he said that one ranch didn't change a town's habits. Adelaide said no, but you started where you could. She started where she could. She taught every child who came to the schoolroom, and she made the schoolroom a place where every child was addressed with the same expectation of intelligence and the same firmness of standard, and she let the children see that this was what she meant by fair. Hector Reyes, for his part, told Jasper one day that the schoolteacher was the best thing that had happened to the town, which Jasper relayed to Adelaide with the matter-of-fact warmth of a man passing along a truth he agrees with completely. The summer of 1881 brought with it something that Jasper had been quietly working toward for 2 years, the breeding arrangement with a rancher in Abilene that would establish the Brenner Ranch as a serious regional operation for quality horses. It came through in June, represented by a contract and a handshake and a visit from the Abilene man, a weathered Scotsman named Malcolm Craigie, who arrived with 2 assistants and a very high opinion of horses and a skeptical opinion of everything else. Craigie spent 2 days looking at everything on the ranch with the thoroughness of a man who had been cheated once and intended not to be cheated again, and Adelaide joined them for most of it because the horses were her concern too, and on the second afternoon Craigie turned to Jasper and said, "Your wife knows horses." "She does," Jasper said. "The gray mare in the 3rd paddock has a slight favoring on her left foreleg. Did you know it?" "I know it," Adelaide said before Jasper could answer. "It's a bruise from last Thursday when she got spooked by a rattlesnake and caught her leg on the fence rail. She's being watched. She'll be sound in another week." Craigie looked at her for a moment. "Most men I deal with would have denied the problem." "I don't deny problems," Adelaide said. "I address them." Craigie signed the contract the following morning. Life on the Brenner Ranch in the years that followed settled into a shape that was full and satisfying in the way that only a life built through sustained effort could be. Adelaide continued teaching. The school had grown to 22 children by 1882, and there was now a proper school building, which still gave her a feeling of proprietary pride every time she walked into it, and she continued her work with the horses, which had expanded and formalized as the ranch grew. She was, in practice if not an official title, the veterinary care for the operation, and word had spread enough that neighboring ranchers occasionally asked for her help with difficult cases. This last development was not without its frictions. Caldwell in 1882 was more settled than the Caldwell she had arrived in, but it was still a world in which a woman's expertise in professional matters was regarded as a pleasant surprise at best and a category error at worst. And there were men who came to her with their animals and could not quite bring themselves to take her instructions seriously until the instructions proved themselves correct, which they generally did. At which point, the men in question tended to become her most reliable referrers, because nothing converts skepticism like results. Jasper had long since stopped being surprised by this pattern. He had told her, early in their work together, that he found people's inability to simply look at what was in front of them baffling, and this opinion had not moderated over time. Storm grew into the finest horse on the ranch, and possibly the finest horse in the county, which was not something Adelaide said out loud because she did not want to be the kind of person who said that out loud, but which she believed privately and completely. He was working now as a breeding stallion, and his first foals were beginning to arrive into the world with that white-starred quality that seemed to come down through his line, and she felt each time she saw one a peculiar pleasure that was partly professional pride and partly something that had no professional component at all. The feeling of a thing come full circle, a beginning that had returned. In the spring of 1883, Adelaide told Jasper she was expecting again. He received this information with less coffee spilling than the first time, but with no less warmth. And Samuel, who was 2.5 years old and had developed strong opinions about most things, was told that he was going to have a sibling, and responded to this information with what Adelaide thought was appropriate gravity. This time the pregnancy was harder than the first, not dangerously so but simply more tiring, and Adelaide found herself grateful for the way the ranch had grown to a point where Jasper had enough help that she could rest when she needed to without the whole operation depending on her being upright. Hector's nephew, a young man named Roberto who had come up from Texas the previous fall, had turned out to be excellent with horses and with the general maintenance of the property. And Chet, who had matured considerably from the enthusiastic 19-year-old who had been knocking over water buckets in the barn, was now a reliable and capable hand who had started talking about saving enough to buy his own small property. Their second child, a girl, was born in December of 1883, and they named her Clara, partly for the steadfast small girl who had brought flowers to their wedding, and partly because the name was one that both Adelaide and Jasper found clean and honest when they said it. Clara Brenner came into the world with her mother's gray-green eyes and her own particular disposition, which proved over time to be determined and curious, and entirely without her father's reserve, a combination that Adelaide found enormously entertaining. She was the kind of child who asked 3 questions where one would have sufficed, and then asked a 4th to be sure. And Jasper, who had never in his life asked more questions than strictly necessary, sometimes looked at her with an expression of affectionate bewilderment that Adelaide thought was one of the better things she had ever seen on his face. Samuel adored his sister with the serious and protective affection of an older brother who has taken his responsibility to heart, and this remained true as they grew, a thread of loyalty that ran through their relationship even when they disagreed, which they did with frequency and good spirits. Pearl Owens died in the winter of 1884, quietly and in her own bed in the Mercer house, which was what she had wanted, and her death left a particular hollow in Adelaide's life that she had not fully anticipated. Pearl had been the first person to be kind to her in Caldwell, the first hand extended in the particular storm of arrival, and Adelaide sat by her bedside at the end and held her hand and told her what she had made possible, and Pearl said, with the dry practicality of a woman who had always told the truth, "You would have managed, but I'm glad I was here to see it." They buried Pearl in the Caldwell cemetery on a cold, clear day in January, and Adelaide stood at the graveside with Jasper's hand in hers and Samuel holding her other hand and Clara in Jasper's arms, and she thought about the strange paths that brought people to one another, and the ways that ordinary kindnesses built into things you could not predict from their beginning. The years moved. The children grew. Storm's descendants spread across the county and began to show up at competitions and in the records of regional breeders as examples of quality. And the Brenner Ranch developed a reputation that satisfied Jasper in the deep way that only work built truly could satisfy. And that satisfied Adelaide for the same reason, because it was hers too, all of it, from the beginning. She thought sometimes about the schoolroom in the spring of 1880, about the morning a year after she had arrived, when she was standing at the board teaching Samuel Dole's older brother. Not her Samuel, the other Samuel, how to divide fractions, and she had looked out the window at the Kansas sky and felt the particular settled quality of a person who has found where they belong. It had not been dramatic, the moment. It had been a fraction lesson on a Tuesday morning, and Corporal was outside tied to the post because Jasper had stopped in on his way past and had not wanted to leave the dog outside alone, and the sunlight was very ordinary, and yet she had known. She had thought then about all the things that had needed to happen for her to be standing in that particular schoolroom on that particular morning. Her father's death and her departure from St. Louis and the $11 and the stage to Caldwell and the storm on the first night, and Pearl Owens saying, "You'd better come inside," and the meeting in the feed store that was entirely unremarkable, and Sunday the mare and the foal that would be called Storm, and the look on Jasper's face in the lamplight when he looked up from the straw and found her looking back, and the porch in the summer dark with Corporal across their feet, and the whole long architecture of the ordinary days, and the work, and the conversations, and the learning of someone that was different from the learning of anything else. All of that to arrive at this Tuesday morning fraction lesson, the smell of chalk and the sound of children working, Corporal outside in the sun. She had found that she felt she had got good value. By the summer of 1885, the town had changed enough that Adelaide could see both what had been lost and what had been gained. The wild edge of the cattle trade was largely gone, and with it some of the electricity that had characterized the town when she arrived, the sense of being at the frontier of something. The railroad had come all the way now, and it brought with it a different kind of commerce, more settled and more regulated, and the population was increasingly families rather than the mobile and restless population of the trail years. There were people who mourned this, who had loved the Caldwell of the Kishom Trail years for its energy and possibility, and Adelaide understood the feeling even while she preferred the Caldwell that was growing in its place, the one with a proper school and a doctor, and a church with a real roof and streets that were beginning to develop the character of permanence. Reverend Gaines retired that year and was replaced by a younger man named Holloway who had ideas about expanding the community's charitable activities that Adelaide found interesting and practical, and that she became involved in with Jasper's complete support. She had Dr. Ellis out to the ranch that summer for a consultation about a persistent cough that Samuel had developed, which turned out to be hay fever, a matter of management rather than crisis. And, in the course of the visit, she and the doctor fell into a lengthy conversation about veterinary medicine and the parallels with human medicine that led to a professional correspondence that continued for years, and eventually to the formal certification of Adelaide's skills through a process that Dr. Ellis facilitated, and that was far harder than it should have been, but that she accomplished. She became, in fact and in name, the veterinarian for a 30-mile radius of Caldwell, which was something her father would have found entirely appropriate. Hector Reyes bought a small piece of land east of the ranch in 1886 and began his own operation, smaller than the Brenner Ranch but well run, and Adelaide and Jasper helped him get it started in the practical ways available to them, which was the right thing and also the thing they most wanted to do. And Hector's wife Carmen became one of Adelaide's closest friends in the county. And their children played together with the Brenner children, in the way that children will when their parents have built something genuine between them. Storm lived to the remarkable age of 23, which was very old for a horse, and which no one who had seen him born into that howling storm found surprising. He died in the late fall of 1902 on a peaceful afternoon, and Adelaide was with him at the end the way she had been with him at the beginning, her hands on him and her voice low, and Jasper stood in the stall doorway and watched, and when it was done he came and stood with her in the quiet stall and put his arm around her, and neither of them said anything for a while. "Good long life," Jasper said eventually. "Yes," Adelaide said, "a very good long life." Storm's descendants were by then spread across 3 counties, and his bloodline was in the records of breeders who had never heard his name or knew his history, who had no idea that he had begun in a Kansas storm one May night in 1879, with a woman's careful hands and a man kneeling in the straw. Samuel Brenner grew up long and quiet-eyed like his father, with his mother's directness and her instinct for things that needed doing, and he had been working horses since he could walk and had no desire to do anything else and no need to. And by the time he was 18, he was the best horseman on the ranch, which Jasper said with a pride he did not bother to conceal. Clara Brenner grew up with questions enough for 3 people and the energy to pursue the answers, and she had her mother's hands with animals and her father's absolute refusal to apologize for being competent, and she left Caldwell at 20 to study medicine in the East, which her parents helped her do with everything they had, and came back 4 years later as the second Dr. Brenner in the county, which was a thing that made Adelaide think of her father with a fullness of feeling she could not have explained, and did not need to. Jasper was 54 years old in the fall of 1905, which meant he was not as young as he had been, but which meant very little else in practical terms, because he was still the man she had watched work through a night of crisis without flinching, and still the man who talked to his horses, and still the man whose silences she had learned to read as thoroughly as his words. He had more gray in his hair now, and his hands showed the years in them, but they were still the hands that had touched her face in the lamplight after the storm, gentle and certain, and she still felt them that way. They sat on the porch in the evening light, the 2 of them, as they had sat on porches for 26 years, and the ranch spread out before them in the autumn gold, and somewhere in the paddock Samuel was working with a young mare, and they could hear his voice carrying the distance. "You know what I was thinking about today," Jasper said. "What were you thinking about?" "The first evening you came out here," he said. "You came to offer your services and you crouched down and Corporal decided you were acceptable." "He was a good judge of character," Adelaide said. "He was," Jasper agreed. "Best judgment call he ever made." He reached over and took her hand, which was the kind of gesture that after 26 years had become as natural as breathing and which had lost nothing of its quality. "Second best was mine." She turned to look at him. He was looking at the horses in the paddock, the way he so often looked at things that mattered to him, steadily and with complete attention, as if looking hard enough was a form of gratitude. "You're going to make me sentimental," she said. "I doubt that," he said. "You're not given to sentiment." "I'm given to exactly the right amount of it," she said. He smiled. The proper full smile that she had been coaxing out of him for 26 years and had never stopped finding worth the effort. "That's probably accurate," he said. The evening settled around them, the golden long autumn evening, with the smell of horses and dry grass, and the sound of Samuel's voice in the paddock, and somewhere, far off, the sound of Clara's buggy coming up the road for supper, which she did on Wednesdays because she had decided it was a family tradition, and had simply announced this one day, and it had become one. And the lights in the ranch house windows were warm against the coming dusk, and this was it, Adelaide thought. This was the whole answer to the question of what she had wanted when she said she wanted to belong to things. She had wanted exactly this. She had not known it precisely until she had it, which seemed to be the way of the truest things, the ones you only recognized in the recognition. Jasper's hand was warm around hers. Samuel's voice rose and fell with the mare. Clara's buggy was closer now, and they could hear her singing something to herself the way she always did when she drove, a habit she had from childhood and had never outgrown. "Jasper," Adelaide said. "Yes. I'm glad you were at the feed store that day." "So am I," he said. "So am I." The night before had rained slightly, and the air had the clean quality of things that had been washed, and the first stars were coming out above the Kansas plains that had been the edge of everything, and were now simply the place they lived, and the place their children had grown, and the place that Storm the colt had been born one screaming May night into a woman's careful hands and a man's open heart. And all of it, had grown from that night in the barn into this evening on the porch, into this life that was fully and completely and wonderfully theirs. Clara pulled the buggy into the yard and got down from it with her black doctor's bag and her mother's gray-green eyes and her absolute belief that she was exactly on time. And Samuel came over the paddock fence and wiped his hands on his trousers and said something to his sister that made her laugh. And the two of them came toward the porch together, and Adelaide stood to meet them with Jasper beside her and the warm light of the house behind them. And the stars above the Kansas sky were innumerable and close, and the night was entirely at peace. This was the home Jasper had come north to build from rocky ground, the one that hadn't been his uncle's ranch in Texas, not a property but a home, the kind with deep roots and warm light and people coming toward the porch in the last of the evening. He had found it. They had built it together, and it was good and it was whole and it was theirs.